Welcome to everyone who's joining. We'll just give it one moment as a couple of people are still entering the Zoom webinar, but it's lovely to see so many of you joining us here today. While we give it a moment, if people would like to say hello in the chat box, feel free to introduce yourselves. It's nice to see who's joining us and from where. Lovely. Okay, well, we'll make a start and I'm sure more people will be joining as we go through. So welcome everyone. It's great to see everybody here today. As you may know, this is a webinar from CFE Research as part of the National Learning and Evaluation Programme for the Fulfilling Lives programme funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. And we're here today with a great range of speakers to be talking about CFE's latest evaluation report that's come from the Fulfilling Lives programme, which is all about addressing homelessness with people facing multiple disadvantage. I'll just run through a couple of technical issues quickly first. So we are on Zoom. I'm fairly confident that a lot of people are familiar with Zoom at this stage, but just in case it's not a platform that you're that familiar with, we have a chat box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screens. And so that's where you can put in any comments. It's great to see people introducing themselves, and we've already got a great range of people from all around the country actually joining us today. So feel free to comment in the chat as we go through. You'll also see a box called Q&A. So that's where you can put in any questions that you have for our panelists. Again, as we go through the presentation, then we can be picking those up. I'm afraid that you're all muted and not on the camera today. That may be a benefit for some of you. That's just to help sure that the panelists, we get the best sort of sound quality and we can kind of focus on the speakers today. But please do interact in the other ways that I've just mentioned as well. As we go through, there'll be a couple of times for questions and answers. I can't promise we'll necessarily get to absolutely all of them, depending on how many questions you're asking us. But what I will do at the end is to collate questions that we haven't been able to get to, and I can follow up with people with our responses by email. So what I'll do now is just to give a quick run through as to who we've got speaking today and where from. So we will be starting today with Dr. Jo Welford, who is Senior Research Manager at CFE, and Jo will be talking through the findings from the More Than a Roof research report that has recently come out, and we can share a link to that in the chat if anyone hasn't necessarily seen the whole report, but Jo will be talking us through the main findings. We'll then move on to hear from Philippa Ivnicki and Elpida Theodorakakou from Inspiring Change Manchester, and they'll be talking about their experiences running a Housing First programme. And after that, we'll take a moment for some questions and answers. And if you could direct your questions to the themes that we've been hearing about from that part of the session, then that would be really great so that we don't get any spoilers for later on. And after that, we'll have a quick break. And then in the second part of the session, we'll be hearing from Julian Jennings and Ursula Marcinkowska, who are two of our national experts from the National Expert Citizens Group. And they'll be talking to us about the perspectives on the importance of housing. And then finally, but definitely not least, we'll be hearing from Sean Mullen from the Revolving Doors Agency, who's the involvement manager there, who will be talking us through the recommendations that have come out of this research report that has just been released. And then a last slot for questions and answers. So that's the plan for today. Really looking forward to talking to you all. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jo.
Thanks, Miranda. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, how's that? All good? Great, okay. Well, yep, thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. And yep, as Miranda said, I'm Jo. I work at CFE Research, and we are evaluating the Fulfilling Lives programme alongside the University of Sheffield. So we're all here today to talk about addressing homelessness for people experiencing multiple disadvantage. And I'm going to start off by talking through our most recent piece of research as part of the national evaluation, More Than a Roof. And this focused on the challenges of the transition from homelessness to stable accommodation, but also tried to pull together some insight on what works for this transition from across the Fulfilling Lives programme. All right, first of all, for the people we have in attendance today who might not have been to one of the webinars before or be that familiar with the programme, I'll just give a bit of background. So the Fulfilling Lives programme, it supports people facing multiple forms of disadvantage. It's funded by the National Lottery and Community Fund in 12 areas of England for up to 8 years. And we're now sadly into the last year of the programme, so we're into year 8. But that does mean that there's been lots of learning so far in understanding the needs of this group and how best to work with them. And the programme has supported over 4,000 people with experience of multiple disadvantage, and it has also worked to change local systems to better support this group going forward beyond the end of the funding. So the report that I'm going to represent some findings from today, this was done by the Fulfilling Lives National Evaluation Team and the National Experts Citizens Group, so the NECG. And we have Sean and Julian and Ursula with us today, so I won't say too much about their role. I'll let them introduce themselves and what they do. But I just wanted to say up front that a lot of the evidence in this report, the personal stories of how difficult it can be to move out of homelessness and maintain this, as well as lots of the thoughts around what worked, came from work undertaken by the NECG and its members. So many of their members, they have experience of homelessness, and they used their local connections to talk to others with this experience, both current and past, to find sort of more about the barriers to getting and remaining in stable accommodation, and really what is key to helping people overcome these barriers and moving out of homelessness permanently. And they also worked up the recommendations, and we'll be presenting these later on. So I've put a link to the full report here. As Miranda says, we can put something in the chat box or disseminate that afterwards, so you don't need to go to it now. Okay, I've put this definition of homelessness up at this point. This is straight out of the report, just to highlight that we're not just talking about rough sleeping. And the definition used for homelessness includes sofa surfing, hostels, night shelters, and any other temporary accommodation. And there are times when I'll talk about rough sleeping in particular, but when we talk about homelessness, it's this broader understanding that we have here. So I think the main point to make about the topic itself is that homelessness is, of course, both the cause and the consequence of multiple disadvantage. There's a high degree of overlap between experience of homelessness and poor physical health, poor mental health, substance misuse, offending, and trauma. Over half the people supported by Fulfilling Lives programmes, so that 4,000 that I talked about at the start, are homeless at least some time during their first 3 months with the programme. And then half again of those, so a quarter overall, spend time rough sleeping in that first 3 months. As well as that, there's a huge amount of instability amongst those who experience homelessness. Here you can see the bottom point, there's over a third who move between at least two different types of accommodation over a 3-month period. And you've got 1 in 10 of those moving between at least 3. However, we feel like that's probably an underestimation of the sort of chaotic accommodation patterns that quite a lot of people experience. From speaking with workers, for those who experience rough sleeping in particular, they're often moving around locations, a night here, a night there, and then back. And so, it's really chaotic and unstable. But we also know that addressing this is a crucial element of tackling multiple disadvantage. We heard this time and time again, not a surprise to anyone on the call. It's not a silver bullet, but if you don't have stable accommodation, then it's so hard to work on other areas of your life. Everything's harder if you've got no fixed abode, registering with a GP, filling in forms, and addressing those basic human needs. I'm sure preaching to the converted here, but we use this universal declaration of human rights as a starting point. Being housed is a human right alongside food, clothing, water, etc. But it can be really hard. So NECG members, as I said, did some work with their peers and discussed this and came back with a whole host of challenges. A lot of these were related to a lack of affordable quality housing in the right locations, but also some people just aren't able to access housing through their local authority if they don't qualify as a priority need group. And in particular, you've got homeless people with no recourse to public funds because of their immigration status. And so they don't qualify for any support. And actually, they'll probably be unwilling to engage with any support that is out there due to a fear of authorities. So lack of social housing in some areas means that, you know, private rented accommodation is often the only option. But, you know, I've heard loads of reported problems with this. Poor quality housing, insecure tenancies, you know, a lack of support can mean that people feel that they're abandoned once they do move into private accommodation. And also the concern that's highlighted by numerous people is this growth of largely unregulated shared accommodation that's exempt from restrictions on the rent that can be covered by housing benefit. So, you know, this is designed to be accommodation that should provide vulnerable people with additional support, but often just leads to them being kind of abandoned in quite squalid and dangerous conditions. As we know, multiple forms of disadvantage can overlap and make life even harder. So substance misuse can be an additional barrier to addressing homelessness. You've got zero tolerance policies on drugs and alcohol in hostels and other accommodation can lead to people with addiction being evicted, you know, leaving them with fewer options and often going back to the streets. And find it difficult to abstain if they're offered temporary accommodation with other drug users or in areas where they've been part of a community of drug users. So if they, or anyone really, remove themselves from this kind of situation to protect or help their recovery, they can then end up being considered intentionally homeless. Now, I think legislation around this isn't particularly clear, or maybe it's just not clear to me anyway, but this came up a lot in discussions with those with lived experience. They felt they had to accept poor quality accommodation offered, or it was in a community that they didn't want to be due to having no links there, or the links that they had were the type that they didn't actually want because they were worried about being defined as intentionally homeless and then ending up with no accommodation at all. So finding accommodation can be difficult, but what we were really interested in was actually when it's secured, how challenging it can be maintaining that accommodation and not returning back to rough sleeping or to homelessness or to kind of other problematic situations. You know, particularly for those who've been homeless or rough sleeping for a long time, it's a really tough transition and it can be daunting if you're not familiar with what's required to maintain a tenancy. Paying bills, organising benefits, managing budgets, you know, can feel overwhelming for some people. And if you don't have support through that transition, you might end up in arrears, being evicted or abandoning tenancies. So we were really interested in what the challenges were around this transition and how that could be helped. So you have those practical and financial challenges, but more than that, we heard again over and over again that isolation can be a real difficulty for people with experience of homelessness and actually a major factor in tenancies or placements breaking down and that return to rough sleeping. If you got a lack of meaningful activity, leads to boredom and return to other behaviours. If you move to an unfamiliar place, new location can be intimidating and involve breaking away from familiar locations and networks. Got a couple of quotes here from the report to highlight the challenges faced. Financially, it can be a struggle. It's arguably getting harder with the cost of living rising. Benefit payments might not cover the full rent. For some, you end up with a difficult choice of getting into debt or finding other ways to keep up with the rent. In this case, using child benefit. And in the second quote, isolation is described as a killer and leading people back to what they know, even if they are trying to make a fresh start. I want to say a little bit about women and homelessness. We wanted to focus on this in particular. It's a priority for the NECG, it's a priority for the programme generally that there's an improvement in gender-informed and gender-specific services. So we know that women face particular risks when it comes to homelessness and rough sleeping, but that experience can be overlooked in favour of the male experience. So we analysed the Fulfilling Lives data, and it looked from this, the data that we had on those 4,000 people, that men are significantly more likely to be homeless and rough sleeping than women. They were outnumbered. So we took that to the NECG, and pretty much everyone we spoke to and everyone they spoke to in their networks, disagreed and felt that actually the data wasn't accurately representing the number of women who are homeless and rough sleeping. And, there's a similar concern over national rough sleeping counts as well that show more men than women on the streets. So you've got women who rough sleep that might hide themselves due to the increased risk to them of harassment and abuse. They take steps not to reveal their location to past or current perpetrators, might stay with family or friends, use public transport, shelter in an A&E waiting room, or just keep moving around in an attempt to avoid the potential for exploitation. One woman talked about sleeping in her car. So being less visible on the streets might mean that women are missed by services and they're not represented in the data, and that's what we have found. Also, rough sleeping amongst women still said to be perceived differently to male rough sleeping, and then some felt that support services can be more judgmental on women, and this might encourage them to hide their rough sleeping or homelessness even more. And then you've got women with children, they're of course particularly fearful of revealing their status to services because of the potential impact this might have on care plans or access rights. There's also other risks faced by women, particular risk of being forced into exploitative situations to keep accommodation, such as prostitution. Temporary accommodation still tends to be mixed sex, and staff might not have the skills required to support women. Mixed sex hostels can, people said they're best, they make women feel vulnerable, and at worst, put them at risk of further abuse and exploitation. But if this is all that's offered, you might be understandably less likely to accept it, leads to a return to the streets or other dangerous or accommodation that puts them at risk. Women also might be more at risk of having their property taken over by current or ex-partners or other associates. Any damage they caused then is the responsibility of the tenant, which can also lead to eviction or debt. So I think the overall kind of point there is, while some women might have a roof over their head, they can be just as vulnerable as if they were rough sleeping, but they might not be picked up by the support that's targeted at those that are visible on the streets. Right, there's plenty on the challenges. So what works, what makes a difference, what are Fulfilling Lives partnerships learn about working with these challenges? So there is, over the time of Fulfilling Lives, there are overall reductions in levels of homelessness and rough sleeping among people who are on the programme. And this is, the last 8 years, there's been a rise in rough sleeping, there's been austerity. So, so things that they've been doing have been working overall as a group. Not for everyone, and it can take a long time, but there have been some improvements. So we're interested in how. So getting people into accommodation is, it's just an ongoing challenge. It involves working within a system that in many areas just haven't got enough affordable quality housing. So I'm actually going to talk more about what works in supporting people to stay in accommodation, to break that cycle of moving back and forth from the streets or other forms of homelessness, because this is where partnerships felt they've been able to have more of an impact as it was less constrained by housing availability. Okay, first on the list, personal budgets. So this is like a ring-fenced pot of money that Fulfilling Lives has been able to protect to support people in whatever way they need to have a positive impact on their lives. So for people taking up their own tenancy, they can use this money to help meet the cost of deposits or purchase essentials to make empty accommodation feel more homely. What carpets, curtains, white goods, that kind of thing. So as well as providing essentials, using the money in this way can help people feel better supported, trusted to manage their new home. Secondly, another essential practical and emotional support. People familiar with Fulfilling Lives will know that one of the key features of their support workers, they're often called navigators, is a small caseload, which allows them to work intensively with their beneficiaries. So they can support that transition into accommodation in whatever way is needed, liaising with housing services, helping fill in forms, set up bills and payments, or just be there to check in that things are going okay. They can link beneficiaries into support to address the underlying causes of their homelessness, rather than just assume that having a roof over their heads will solve everything. And then fit in the support provided to the needs of the individual rather than sort of following a rigid offer of support and have a higher success rate. And the support needs to be ongoing if needed as well. For some people, getting and staying settled in accommodation can take a really long time. You've got relapses and bumps in the road. The people on the Fulfilling Lives programme who didn't see much change in their homelessness or rough sleeping levels, those that didn't show a significant improvement, they were the ones that tended to leave the programme within the first year or so. So we are talking like long-term support here and plenty of time to actually make a difference for people. It's crucial that support doesn't end abruptly once accommodation is secured. I heard stories of people going from 24/7 support in a hostel to then nothing, and that sort of huge drop off is a big issue. But I'm sure in the Housing First presentation we'll talk about that as well. This support, it can be provided by peers and can be provided really well by peers. So people with lived experience of homelessness themselves, have been through similar experiences and understand the difficulties involved in moving into settled accommodation, and that can make people feel less alone. They can play an important role in getting people involved in social and other activities and reduce that risk of boredom. It can take time to settle in. So if you have the same peer mentor, you get some consistency and stability if other areas of your life are changing as well. Last on the list, Housing First. There's loads of supporters of this approach amongst Fulfilling Lives partnerships, loads of evidence that it works. And the next presentation is going to talk about that, so I'm not going to expand on that point any further. The last thing I wanted to talk about today is supporting women in particular out of homelessness. We were hoping to have a women's outreach worker on the call today to talk about her role, but she couldn't make it, so I'm going to run through a few things that she talked to us about. So having women-specific workers, particularly outreach workers who will go out looking for those who are hidden, trying to hide themselves, are so crucial to engage these women in services and support them with their particular needs. We heard about women-only drop-in centres being set up, because they knew that there was a number of rough sleeping women in the area that just weren't going to the drop-ins that were open to all. The fact that people were attending those did show that women will access services if they're offered in a safe, unthreatening environment. And if you've got a specialist women's worker who has knowledge of other services, sex worker support services and things like that, they can then signpost people appropriately. Specialist women's workers, they can build relationships with women on the streets and engage them. Again, it takes time, it all takes time, but if they do become known in the area as being able to help and being non-judgmental and, actually being able to support rather than put sanctions on, it can and has led to others coming forward for support. Time consuming to do well, so it's only going to work with small caseloads. And also these workers need to not be constrained by working only with female rough sleepers, the visible ones, but able to support those who are vulnerably housed as well, given what we know about the risks faced by women in some situations that might appear to be better than rough sleeping, but actually just as high risk. Second point, single-sex accommodation options needed in all areas to make sure that women don't have to accept offers of mixed-sex accommodation. And women told us these can feel safer and also more homely. There's also a real shortage of options for women with children. So if you can have an offer for them too, it might make women less anxious about engaging with services if they had that option. Finally, to reduce the risk of coming into contact with perpetrators or their peers, it's been suggested that services and accommodation for women need to be discreet and need to be available in multiple sites in a community. And this last quote here shows that, the difference between this and a more open form of support. If women can be seen going for advice, it might put themselves at further risk. Okay, that is everything for me. The report does have some recommendations, as I've said already, but I'm going to leave those to later for Sean and the others to go through. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions, we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A before the break, but also more time afterwards. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jo, for walking us through that really interesting piece of research. So as Jo was saying, please do feel free to put thoughts and questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. We'll pick them up in both parts of Zoom. But for now, I will hand over to Philippa and Elpida, and I will be sharing your presentation. So hopefully everyone can see that. Great.
Great, thank you, Miranda. So as Miranda mentioned, my name is Philippa of NECG. I'm the Research and Evaluation Officer for Inspiring Change Manchester, which is a Fulfilling Lives programme. Do you want to just go to the, yeah, thank you. ICM is a partnership made up of Shelter, Back on Track, CLI and Big Life Group, which was funded by the National Lottery from 2014 to 2022. Also with Elpida Theodora Kaku, who's a Housing First worker, and she's been part of the Housing First team since it started at the very beginning. Go to the next slide. So I'm sure many of you have heard the term Housing First before, might even have a bit of an understanding of exactly what that means, but just to give everyone a brief overview, Housing First is an evidence-based approach for supporting homeless people facing multiple disadvantage. It's based on the 7 key Housing First principles, which if you just go to the next slide, we've got a video where, a bit of an old video where the team are going to talk you through what these principles mean.
These are the principles of Housing First.
Housing is a human right and everybody deserves a home.
Flexible support is provided for as long as is needed. Providers commit to long-term offers of support with no fixed term end date. The individual will be fully supported when transitioning away from the Housing First model.
Housing and support is separated. Housing First is different if you don't essential support plans.
Individuals have choice and control. People aren't told where they have to live. They can choose the type of housing and its location.
An active engagement approach is used. Staff will be encouraged to work creatively and support will be tailored to the individual.
Services are recovery orientated to identify every individual's strengths and goals.
A harm reduction approach is used. You do not have to be abstinent from substances to come onto Housing First.
So I think this quote by Homeless Link explains Housing First really well. Housing First is about providing a stable home without conditions around housing readiness, which is opposed to the traditional stepped model, which is more commonly used, which supports people to build towards being housing ready through conditions such as how much they engage with support or sobriety. And then they're only placed into housing last, almost as a reward, once it's deemed that they're able to maintain a tenancy. Can just go to the next slide. Thanks. So ICM's Housing First journey. In the first few years of ICM, we weren't using Housing First, and it was recognised that this traditional stepped model of supporting our members to become housing ready wasn't working very well for some of the members who faced greater challenges around engagement and who were maybe more entrenched in homelessness. At the time, there was already a lot of evidence to show that Housing First could work in sort of different parts of the country, particularly in the US. This isn't something that had ever been trialled in Manchester. And so ICM took the decision to launch a pilot here. This was initially a 2-year pilot running from April 2016, due to end in March 2018. And during this time, we commissioned the University of York to carry out an in-depth evaluation. Both the interim and final report showed that Housing First was having a really positive impact on the members that the team was supported. And so because of the flexible nature of Fulfilling Lives funding, we were able to respond to this and then extend the Housing First service to the end of ICM coming up in March this year. Over this time, the Housing First programmes evolved. We originally had a development worker embedded in the team specifically to develop and establish networks with social landlords. This was to educate them and help them to understand the wraparound support that Housing First members received. And then once we'd built up this network, the role could evolve and change into somebody who supported delivery while also maintaining these relationships. So what does the ICM Housing First model look like? Obviously, we have the high fidelity with the 7 core Housing First principles that we went through. And this was something that the independent evaluation carried out by the University of York found. We closely follow those 7 Housing First principles. And this was one of the original aims when the service was set up. It was something we really wanted to achieve. All the key principles are adhered to equally. So, for example, housing and support are truly separate in the ICM model, which allows housing first workers to fully advocate for their members in a way that would not have been possible if there was a dual responsibility as a support service and a landlord. One of the key housing first principles is obviously that housing is a human right, and so it should be accessed sort of immediately. But another key principle is choice and control. And so our housing first workers apply both these principles equally. So it means that ICM have supported housing first members to turn down a property if they don't want it for any reason, if they feel it's unsuitable at all. And that might initially, when you first think about housing first, that might not seem to align with it, turning down a property, but it gives members choice and control while supporting them to make the decision themselves. So they're more likely to remain for a longer period in a tenancy if they've chosen it and they're happy with it. For ICM, Housing First is sort of a service within a service. So not all ICM members are supported through the Housing First model. The majority of our members are supported by a wider engagement team through the traditional stepped model that I mentioned earlier, which doesn't adhere to Housing First principles. Then within the wider engagement team, there's a smaller Housing First team who are trained in Housing First principles. They have lower caseloads and higher resources, and it means they're able to deliver support in line with the Housing First model. This was done because although ICM recognises the significant benefits that come from the Housing First model, it is very resource intensive. And so in order to provide support to a larger number of members, the traditional model continued alongside Housing First. Peer mentoring is another key element of support across ICM, which is probably a result of community-led initiatives, one of our partners being a peer-led organisation. So this means that all Housing First members thank you. All Housing First members have support through peer mentoring from somebody with similar life experience to them who can truly advocate for them. We also use the membership model to balance active engagement with choice and control. This means our members can make a choice of the level of support they want to engage with over time. And so it's not, if they at one point don't want to engage with a lot of support, it's not seen as them not engaging and them being close to the service. It's also important when delivering Housing First to ensure Housing First workers are properly supported so they're able to work in line with Housing First principles. The sort of typically recommended caseload for a Housing First worker is somewhere between 7 and 10, but for ICM we've capped this at the lower end at 7, which gives them more flexibility and just essentially time to spend with each of their members. Reflective practice is also an important part of the service design. So this means Housing First workers have those tools so that they can deliver this kind of support. Other things we found to be central to the success is the wider programme of support we have at ICM. So arts-based activities, education and training and employment services, which all link into our different partners. And this creative engagement with members through things like an art class, IT course, a day out or something, helps to facilitate that active engagement, which is one of the key principles of Housing First. If you could go to the next slide, please. So when we look at the success of ICM's Housing First programme, the first thing we look at is the impact it's had on the members that have been the team have supported. So over the lifetime of ICM's Housing First time, 26 members were supported, and we used 3 different assessment scores throughout the time they were supported to measure the impact. And here I've compared this with the same assessment scores for members supported by the wider ICM team through that stepped model. The difference in outcomes can accurately be attributed to Housing First model, as all the other factors, things like having a flexible fund, person-centred working, are constant for everyone supported across ICM. When we look at the improvements in assessment scores, we can see that in both cases, step model and Housing First, there's an overwhelmingly positive increase. But if we look just at Housing First members, we can see that the increase is much more positive if they're being supported through using the Housing First principles. If you can go to the next slide. As with the assessment scores, we can see that there's a positive outcome in tenancy sustainment for Housing First members. Of the 26 members I mentioned who were supported as part of Housing First, 23 of them are now in stable accommodation. Housing First tenants consistently maintain longer tenancies than other ICM members, with the average tenancy length being almost 2.5 years for Housing First members, in comparison to just under a year for those supported through the stepped model. And this is most likely because our Housing First team advocate for longer permanent tenancies rather than temporary tenancies as other members might receive. Only 20% of the tenancies ended as a result of the tenancy breaking down, with none of these being the result of forced eviction. And then if we compare this to ICM members across the board, supported through the stepped model, 29.7% of the tenancies ended due to the tenancy breaking down. And that's really important when you consider that the members supported through Housing First might have never had a tenancy before. You know, they were the ones really struggling to maintain a tenancy. So the fact that there is that difference in outcome is really, really important to recognise. As the programme winds down, it's also important to think about the lasting impact that the services had on the wider picture in Manchester. As the Housing First pilot was the first Housing First pilot in Manchester, we really started the discussion around the impact Housing First could have and created a wide evidence base to show the success going forwards. And I've included this quote from the University of York evaluation we had, which just, I think, demonstrates how we did demonstrate this approach across the city and showed that it could work, and it did have the same outcome that it'd been proved to have in other areas. If you just go to the next slide. We also identified one case study who'd been on the Housing First programme for a long time, and we spoke to her about what she felt had made an impact on her. So I'm going to pass you over to Elpida, who worked with Sarah for a very long time and can tell you a little bit about her journey.
Okay, hi all, my name is Elpida. I'm a Housing First engagement worker, and I'm just going to speak a little bit about Sarah. I will be reading through my documents, so bear with me. So we can demonstrate the Housing First principles through Sarah's journey. She's someone that was facing multiple and complex needs from the very beginning of her adult life. She was battling severe alcohol addiction in combination with past trauma and ongoing abusive relationships. Sarah knew what she wanted regarding housing, and she was not willing to compromise. She's been there, done that, she said many times. Although she was working with a few day centers, she said that she was tired of people offering her rooms with conditions. We discussed Housing First, and she felt like that was something that she would like to try. She had nothing to lose. Sarah liked that we were flexible and person-centered, and that she could choose how she was supported. She liked the feeling that she was in charge of her journey, as well as the fact that she was able to make her own decisions without being judged. Furthermore, she liked that we respected the way she felt about housing, and that we were able to house her with no strings attached. Sarah knew that as soon as she was housed, she could ask Housing First to stop working with her or supporting her, and she would not lose her property. She also knew that she did not have to stop drinking, and also she did not want to. Sarah found the first property, but it was full of mold. She was desperate, though, to move in, and she didn't care about the standard of the property. We agreed to keep looking, even though she was getting quite impatient and agitated. The second property was in an area she wanted, and as she wanted it. The property standard was high this time, and she was really surprised and pleased. To start with, it was difficult, as she did not have a tenancy before for many years. We knew that the actual work would start once she was in. It made sense. She was transitioning from having no responsibilities to having to pay bills. To start with, again, she was not able to budget or control her own door, and we were worried that we will find her dead, either from alcohol or the people that were going in and out of her property. Sarah did ask for rehab, and we were able to support her to get in with the help from social services. It really wasn't difficult to convince. It really wasn't easy to convince them, but we did convince them to give her a chance. After the first time in rehab, she came back to her flat, and we were quickly able to recognize that she needed to move so she can actually make sustainable changes. To be honest, Sarah was the one that said, I really need to move. My head is clearer this time round. This is not good for me. We were able to find another property for her while she was in rehab for the second time. It was a miracle convincing social services to give her another chance, but we did manage to show that was the way forward. When Sarah moved into her new flat, it was like a light bulb moment for her. She loved it, and it has helped with her sobriety journey. She has been in the property for over 2.5 years, and she has managed to stay off alcohol for the same amount of time. According to her, there's no going back. Her income is maximized. When she was awarded PIP, I felt elated. Getting PIP for Sarah has always been my Everest out of the all people I've worked with, as we did try that 3 times before, but we missed deadlines, assessments, everything that comes with PIP. So either she was intoxicated, or we couldn't find her, or she was at the hospital. She has various health conditions, but she manages them great at the moment. However, she does have support from a different service if she needs to. I did the referral. She had many peers that helped for many times. especially when she lacked motivation, either to go to an AA meeting or any meeting really. There were people that they had similar experiences as far as domestic violence or alcohol is concerned, and she was able to connect with them on a different, definitely deeper level. It is fair to say that the flexible fund personal budget has made the support we gave to Sarah 100 times easier. We paid for deposit, first month's rent 2 times, 2 or 3 property cleanups, hotel accommodation for 2 nights when we were waiting to go from the second rehab to her third flat, the second flat really. We paid for at least 4 TVs and the TV license along with a year of rental telephone landline, so her health emergency button can be connected to the emergency services, clothes, food shopping, utility top-ups, many taxi ride, bus, tram tickets, train tickets, over 10 mobile phones, and many top-ups. But we also paid for manicures, hair appointments for her to feel better, sessions for her and myself and peers to go and have a coffee at Costa or Nero for her to chill, not to feel that she was in a session, museum trips and art equipment because she loves doing that. What the flexible fund did, it allowed us to put her mind and worries at ease and concentrate on the quality of support we were giving her. At the moment, just to see where she is paying for her own TV license and Netflix via a direct debit. I know this is not a lot to many people, but for Sarah, it's really big. I have been her main worker from the beginning until the end. She was able to trust me on occasions where she was putting a front for other people and services. The fact that I had a very small caseload between 6 and 8 people, and I was very flexible and available once she needed me really, helped our relationship blossom. I met this lady in March 2016, and I did not think that she would make it the first couple of years. I can certainly say that her life now has improved significantly since that first meeting, and it does make me a little bit emotional to know that she allowed me to be part of her journey. That's the end of the presentation.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much to Elpida and Philippa and Joe for those first section of the presentations. And I mean, there's just so much there that we could sort of explore and talk about for ages. We have got some questions coming through, so that's great. So we'll sort of take a few of those right now. I'll start with Joe. A question for you, Joe, about working on the research that's led to this report. Is there anything that you found particularly surprising as you were doing the research that came through, or is there anything that sort of stuck in your mind and really stayed with you?
I guess for us, the strength of the feeling when the bit I said about the data from Fulfilling Life showing that, you know, there's loads more men experiencing rough sleeping in particular than women, and, you know, taking that to the experts and just the strength of actually that is just not right at all. You know, there's loads more women out there. They're just really hidden. They hide themselves, and, you know, people telling us that actually workers find that, you know, when you know where the women are, it's actually, you know, 50-50. And, you know, I work in Leicester, I walk through Leicester in the morning and, you know, walk past male rough sleepers, but, you know, the women just aren't visible. So I suppose that's gonna definitely stick with me as yeah, they are there. They just need finding, and they need engaging with. Yeah, probably it was one of many, I guess, that was really kind of powerful.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that really sort of highlights the strength of this partnership with the national experts being such a key part of the research as well, that they were able to show that element where it was being missed in the data and why, and then that gave a whole other part to explore within the research. Brilliant. Okay, I've got a question for Philippa and Elpida, either or, whoever'd like to answer. So this is a question about the high fidelity to the Housing First principles that you went through. I think, you know, it's fantastic that your pilot, the evaluation showed that you were able to really stick to those principles. And I suppose part of the question is thinking maybe those can sometimes be a bit difficult to adhere to. So the question is whether you have any advice for a new Housing First project that's starting up in terms of how to stick to those principles.
Yeah, I think one of the things is important to recognise why and how that high fidelity is important. You know, being a Fulfilling Lives programme, we do have the luxury of being well resourced, and like I mentioned, we had the ability to be flexible in sort of the number of people we decided to support. And I think other Housing First providers maybe might try to deliver Housing First sort of as best as they can under difficult circumstances, which can then compromise the Housing First principles essentially. So for example, if there's pressure to take on more referrals and then the caseload ends up increasing above that kind of recommended limit, and then, you know, if you've got a high caseload, it's impossible to deliver the active engagement that LPDA delivers. You know, she couldn't do that if she had double the amount of people. It's just not possible. I think ICM initially had a higher target for the number of people we were meant to support, but then when we decided to go ahead with Housing First, we had the flexibility to drop that down, and we still, you know, supported a huge number of people, but obviously being given that flexibility meant we were able to maintain high fidelity. So it's not, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do at all. I think in terms of advice, I'd say throughout service design and delivery, make sure the Housing First principles are really factored in and kept at the forefront of everybody's minds. Things like making sure housing and support are separate where possible, you know, all the different things that we've mentioned about the way support's delivered. Flexible funds, really important. And I know LPDA went into a bit of depth about how that really helped her with her support. Visiting other Housing First services, learning from each other, you know, thinking about what others have done and how that might work in your area or how it might not, or getting in contact and just asking, you know, what's been learned. I'm sure everyone's always really willing to share their learning. And I think, and I know I touched on this, but making sure Housing First workers are really supported properly, because otherwise it's not doable. You know, things like the reflective practice, manageable workloads, and making sure there's the ability to feed back when things aren't working, because it's the Housing First workers who would be the first to know if you know, the principles are slipping. I don't know if you want to add anything, LPDA, you're the expert.
Yeah, just everything you said, and just a couple of things. Very, very important, support and housing separate. This is why our clients were able to trust us and to have a relationship with us. I don't know what a housing officer would do if they were going to a property that somebody was using or drinking or was very messy or there were holes on the walls. So as far as we are concerned, we could go in a property and they knew they wouldn't be judged. That's major. Also, the flexible fund, again, what difference does this make? Like going for coffees just to have a chat, and then people were able to open up, or just don't talk about housing, don't talk about your bills, let's just go shopping. I have that amount of money. Things like that, and small caseload, flexibility around that. I know how privileged I was to be able to see every single client of mine, literally every single day, twice a day sometimes, when they wanted it. So yeah, and also they trust us, management did trust us, trust our own judgment and how we were working with people. It was a really good project to work for, and you know, flexibility, trust, and the flexible fund made a big difference for us.
Great, thank you. And actually the questions are flying through, so I'll just take another one on Housing First, if that's okay. And actually this picks up on a comment that's come through in the chat, which says that if setting up a new Housing First model, commissioners and funders need to be realistic in how many people they can work with and resource accordingly. So kind of linked to that point, somebody's asked about how Inspiring Change Manchester decided who would get a tenancy through the Housing First pilot.
Maybe I can answer that. So to start with, ICM was set up with, I was a specialist in accommodation. And then within a year, the Housing First project came in. In the meantime, we knew who would be more suitable, or who we thought would be more suitable for the Housing First project. So it wasn't people that they were either ready to move in or ready to stop drinking or using, or, you know, engage with us really, because ICM was all about people not engaging. We need to make them engage with us. So my caseload to start with when I was a specialist was 45 people. From those 45 people, I was able to choose between 6 and 8 people. It wasn't suitable for all of them. We did drop at least 2 that I can think of after trying to work with them. And eventually they said, you know what, this project is not for me. I don't want to do it. Or we recognize that somebody having their own accommodation, their own flat was not suitable for them. They weren't ready to, they just didn't want to. It was the loneliness thing that Joe spoke before. It wasn't people that we weren't the last chance saloon. It was the people that they wanted to be in a property and they felt they could make it with a little bit of support.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm afraid I'm going to try and keep us to time. There are more questions coming through, but we do have a slightly longer slot for questions and answers later. So I'm keeping hold of those. So don't lose hope if your question hasn't been answered yet. I'm just aware of the time, so we'll take a quick break now. We will be back at 11:05. And after the break, we'll be hearing from Julian and Ursula about their perspectives on the importance of housing and what having stable housing enables you to be able to do in the rest of your life as well. So please don't go anywhere. We'll be back at 11:05 and look forward to some more conversations then. Just start the recording again. Fantastic. Well, we've had a great sort of first session with so much to talk about, and I'm afraid there's just even more coming. Now we'll hand over to Julian and Ursula, who are going to be talking about the importance of housing. And Sean, I believe you're going to share the slides for this.
Yeah. So I think Julian's going to read out our first slides. You okay, Julian?
I've lost my audio. I don't know if you can hear me. I've lost the audio.
Yeah, we can hear you now, mate. We can hear you. Can you not hear us?
Oh, what's going on? You can hear me. I've lost the audio, Sean.
We can hear you.
Bluetooth connected.
Sean, I've lost the audio. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can't hear anything.
We can hear you.
Okay, I can't hear you, but I'll just speak anyway, shall I? You could run the slides, Sean. That'd be brilliant. Sorry about this. So my name's Julian Jennings, and I'm a person with lived experience from Opportunity Nottingham. Welcome. This is National Expert Citizens Group. It's feedback to the Housing and Homeless Report, February 2022. Have the next slide, please, Sean. Well, the aim of the NECG, the aim of the NECG is to ensure lived experience shapes system change and creates future services that are co-produced, accessible and designed for people who have experienced multiple disadvantage. Have the next slide, please. The NECG strategic priorities helping create services designed for people with co-occurring substance and alcohol use and mental health dual diagnosis. This will include providing support for people who want support but are not yet abstinent. Number two, it's improving the support for people leaving prison and people with repeat contact with the criminal justice system. Number three, developing approaches to prevent drug-related deaths and to adapt to changes in the drug use, e.g. rising crack cocaine, prescription drugs and new psychoactive substances. So 4, developing appropriate accommodation options for people who experience multiple disadvantage. And 5, designing services that are appropriate for women and who have experienced multiple disadvantage. Could I have number 3, please? Well, the aims of today, we are presenting some of the emerging recommendations and giving 2 real-life stories to show how important housing is for those who are facing multiple disadvantage. This will be done by 2 NECG members, myself and Ursula. Next slide, please. The main focus, the 2 main questions we asked our members were, how important is it to get the right housing, especially for those facing multiple disadvantage? And number 2, what helped me getting settled? We do believe that housing is the foundation that recovery can be built upon. It's the beginning of getting things started. Next one, please. Housing and its importance. We've called this report More Than a Roof, based on a quote from one of the people who had lived experience, who experienced homelessness, who provided many of us insights into the report. This neatly encapsulates the need to address homelessness, not just with housing and not just any housing, but with the ongoing holistic support to help people settle into and maintain their tenancies. Patterns of homelessness are different for men and women. Women hide due to fears of violence and can be in dangerous, exploitative situations. However, they may still be under a roof and therefore not able to access rough sleeping support or to be engaged with street outreach teams. This next one, please. This is me. Okay, 1 second. So I'm Jimmy. This housing was the stepping stone that enabled me to move forward with my life and to deal with other disadvantages I was facing. However, housing is more than just a roof. It's more than just a place to sleep. That housing has to be safe and welcoming and homely. It needs to be your safe place. And if it's not, then all the other issues will be that much harder to deal with. I was in recovery and was sent to a drug house after being in a hostel. Loads of people using, and I ended up using again. Also being involved with a drug trade when I was there, trying to stay clean. So I left the house after being abused, but it was deemed then I'd made myself intentionally homeless. No one was prepared to help. They sent me backwards, all because my housing had not been safe. I believe it is imperative for people facing multiple disadvantage to have safe housing. This is the basis from which other parts of recovery flow. For my safe housing, I was able to stabilise my substance use and eventually get clean. This has enabled me to get support for my own mental health recovery, as I've been the last 3 years diagnosed with bipolar type 1. From this, I was able to get involved in my community and eventually start volunteering in the Nottingham Expert Citizens Group and with then the NECG. The road to recovery can be a long and winding road. It's a journey that is made a lot easier when you have a safe and secure home to go to. The supported housing group that I joined enabled me to deal with my mental health, and the support which came from that helped me to secure housing. This has been a foundation to my recovery and maintaining my mental health. Without this, I may have continued in the spiral of mental health episodes and addiction and unsecure housing, potentially leading to homelessness again. That's me. That's me, Sean.
Sorry, I think that's Ursula's.
Okay, so hi, I'm Ursula, an expert by life experiences. So the importance of getting housing right. The dangers of not getting the right accommodation for both men and women is that you are unable to, I can't see that because of the photo, unable to
move out of toxic and even dangerous situations.
Thank you. Move out of toxic and even dangerous situations you may be living in. Many, but especially women, are forced to stay in toxic relationships, sometimes with children involved, which affects your mental health, physical health, and ability to deal with any other issues you might be facing. My first experience of temporary accommodation many years earlier, when I was about 22, I was in a women's refuge with a newborn baby, and it was very cold. And I didn't feel safe, and this led me returning to the place I was trying to leave. The cold was so off-putting, I went back where it come from, which was not a good place. Later, I became homeless after getting into rent arrears and went initially to local temporary accommodation. I can only describe this mixed-sex accommodation as unsavoury and requested a move to somewhere else. After 3 weeks, I was moved to a small women-only hostel, which had up to 8 beds. During this time, I received support to manage my rent arrears. And after moving out of the hostel, I lived in the community again for 5 years until I needed to remove myself again from a toxic relationship. After my positive previous experience at the women-only hostel, and knowing it was a safe refuge, I self-referred and spent another 18 months there. While I was there that long, I think I got into arrears again, and I sorted all that out. The positive, safe environment of the hostel gave me the time and support needed to move back into independent accommodation. During my time there, I undertook daily activities, including crafts, swimming, gardening, and lots of different groups. And it felt more like a home than a hostel. It felt almost like a family. I think it helped that it was a small unit. I spent the last 6 months of my time at the hostel living in the move-on accommodation with 4 other ladies that also suited my needs. The support was tapered off during this time, and staff helped me to apply for a council flat, and they helped me with moving in and getting white goods, etc. For another 3 months, I worked with the same worker to manage the transition out of supported accommodation, which for me was enough time. Not long after moving into my flat, I felt stability. This gave me the self-confidence to be able to further integrate back into the community and further boosting my confidence to the extent that I'm still in the same flat 10 years later. My positive experience of a small women-only hostel and the support given there was integral to my moving out of homelessness and dealing with the other disadvantages I was facing at the time. For me, secure housing within which I was supported was the stepping stone I needed to move on to a more stable life.
Sorry, I'm going to stop that share, and then I'm just going to share, bear with me, the recommendations. So if I can just share the recommendations. Thanks, Ursula and Julian. You know, really putting sort of real life stories on the bones there, and just showing how important housing is to you know, centre you and ground you really, and deal with sort of all the other issues. And I think Ursula made a great point there about the tapering off of support. You felt that it was fine for you, but I know the guys from Housing First have mentioned how important it is to keep that support in until the people are ready to move on. So I'm just going to go through some of the recommendations of the report. So ensuring appropriate accommodation. Address a problem of poor quality housing. So local authorities need to be able to take responsibility for the quality of housing to which they refer people to, whether in the private sector, social housing, or their own stock. If you're worrying about the property that you're living in and it's not fit, then it's going to make you both physically and mentally ill. You know, and how do you deal with the other issues you're facing if you've got mental and physical illness coming from your housing? So local authorities really need to take responsibility of this and make sure that houses are fit for people to live in. Individuals should never be made intentionally homeless as a result of leaving or refusing inadequate accommodation. And I think one of the great things about Housing First is that support of people to say no if they don't think it's appropriate. But a lot of people we've heard, if they turn something down that they don't think is appropriate, are then made intentionally homeless and don't get the support of the local authority then. Temporary accommodation needs to be in a location that allows people to access their support networks to ensure placements do not exacerbate disadvantage. Moving people away from their support networks can be really detrimental to the individual. So we need to think about those things and think about getting people tacked into the local community to fill their time. Organisations providing supported accommodation must be held to high standards. Regulation is needed, including clear quality standards for housing and landlord responsibility, with sanctions if quality standards are not met. Local authorities should only refer people to quality assured accommodation. We're seeing this so much in houses of multiple occupancy, where landlords are taking a lot of money to support people with not giving them support and really unsavoury accommodation. So this needs to change and regulation is needed in this area. All supported accommodation providers must sign up to local authority quality standards, and the support they provide must be continually monitored. Funding will be required for local authorities to be able to manage this, but it's not impossible to manage. You know, we need a system so we know who are the good landlords and who are the bad landlords, what is appropriate accommodation, what is inappropriate, and tenants must know about the standards to be aware of their rights to complain. You know, people need to know what they're entitled to know what they are getting or aren't getting. There needs to be alternatives to large hostels. Beyond emergency provision, large hostels are often not appropriate for people experiencing multiple disadvantage. There needs to be small, supported, shared living spaces where there is a balance between independence and community for those who may not be ready for independent living. And independent living is not for everybody. So, you know, this needs to be available. Semi-independent flats with support should be part of the transition to fully independent accommodation. Helping people access and maintain stable accommodation is central to people dealing with the issues they're facing. Fund more workers to support people living in independent accommodation. Tenancy support workers are needed to provide the support required when moving into independent accommodation, particularly after long periods away from this. Without support, people feel abandoned and set up to fail. People can use peer mentors to support people in their accommodation. There's lots of ways to do this, but people need support so they're not on their own. Support must be for a duration appropriate to the individual, and they should be involved in the decision as to how long support should last. And ideally, this should be a minimum of 6 months. As Ursula said, 3 months was appropriate for her, but maybe not appropriate for many people. And one of the great things about the Housing First is that support only falls away when the person feels they're ready for it. So it's really leaving the individual up to their own choices. Support for life skills, budgeting, cooking, cleaning, etc. is essential. Many people have never done this or have, you know, got out of the habit of doing it, and they need support to get back into doing these things. Many people may find it straightforward, but lots of people don't. Workers should have small caseloads to allow for intensive support during the transition into independent accommodation. And I think the guys from ICM sort of said it out loud and clear. 7 to 10 clients in the Housing First model, rather than 50 to 60 clients, which, you know, some people could have, which is impossible to support those individuals. So really small caseloads are, you know, central to this. Personal budgets should be available to help sustain tenancies and enable a good life. People need personal budgets, both for practical needs, to buy kitchen appliances, etc., and to enable community interaction, for example, to travel to community groups or buying equipment for hobbies. If you engage people, you fill their time, they will find things that they can do that they're good at. You know, don't focus on what people can't do or the problems that people face it, look at what they can do and open their eyes to other things that they can get involved in. Support staff should have the flexibility with this to focus on what people can do and support them to develop a good life. That's what we want. We're looking for people to have good lives, not just lives. Peer support workers should be integrated into the tenancy support system. So people with lived experience can offer essential peer support that is vital for the transition into independent accommodation. These are the people that have bought the t-shirt, they've been there, seen it and done it. They're the ones that can help other people move on. So peer support is essential. People need to belong to a community. Relationships, meaningful activities, positive connections, and the longer term support are central to combating isolation and moving away from homelessness. Peer supporters can help people link into the community. If people don't feel grounded in the community, if they don't feel safe and secure in their home and part of that community, the likelihood is that they may lose the tenancy and go back to homelessness, which is what we don't want. And most importantly, peer supporters workers must be paid. However, additional volunteering roles can be a stepping stone into paid peer support roles. You cannot do this on the cheap. We need to pay peer supporters for their time and their experience. Housing First should continue to be funded to support people with experience of multiple disadvantage, and the Housing First programs must adhere to the principles. Housing First offers a solution that combines independent accommodation and wraparound support, and this has been shown to work to support people to maintain their own tenancies, but only if it's done properly. We hear, you know, the great thing about Housing First, but if you water it down, sometimes it doesn't work. So you can't do this on the cheap. Housing First requires excellent, genuinely person-centered wraparound support with peer support workers, navigators, and crucially, small caseloads and personal budgets. As Alpida has said, you know, it's crucial. Local authorities and partners need proactive strategies to ensure their housing, homelessness services are fully inclusive and reflect the communities they serve. So people with lived experience and community groups must be central to the creation and the delivery of strategies. Integrate people into systems so they feel safe and secure. And that will work. Services must ensure their workforce reflects the diversity of the communities they serve. Nothing about us without us. We need people from all communities to work with people from different communities, so everybody gets support. And there should be a person-centered approach where ethnicity and culture are taken into account to reduce the risk of cultural isolation. Supporting women out of homelessness. Homeless women and those who are living in vulnerable or high-risk situations should be a priority for action and support, not just those identified as roughs sleeping on the streets, as Joe spoke about earlier. Patterns of homelessness are different for men and women. Women will hide due to fears of violence and can be in dangerous, exploitative situations. However, they may still be under a roof and they're therefore not able to access rough sleeper support or be engaged by street outreach teams. Many women are hidden homeless. We don't see them sleeping in the doorways, so therefore they don't come up on the rough sleeping numbers, but they're there and they're in danger. So we need to sort of support women to get out of this vulnerability. And local authorities and partners should develop specific pathways, services and strategies for women experiencing multiple disadvantage. And the ideal approach should include Female support workers and navigators with lived experience, with outreach services developed to engage with this more hidden group of women. Ursula's story told us how being in a hostel for women only, supported by women, made the difference for her. And these things are crucial to support women back into housing and back into sort of using services and dealing with the disadvantages. Smaller women-only supported accommodation, which is trauma-informed and includes options for women with children. Many women with children who are living in precarious situations won't come forward because they're scared that the children may be taken off them, or things can happen. So if we have these smaller supported accommodation for women, particularly with children, they can get the support and the safety they need. Independent accommodations, accommodation options close to amenities, schools, shops, etc., help embed women in the community. There's no point in giving somebody a accommodation, particularly if they've got kids, if they can't get them into the local schools, if they can't use the local facilities. It's pointless. So we really need to think about this, being close to amenities. Discrete women-only services in multiple sites across the community, easily accessible, but not known to the wider male community using services. We hear so many times that women are scared to go to services because the people who have abused them may be at those services as well. They may bump into people that they don't want to bump into. So we need these discrete women-only services dotted around different parts of the towns and cities. And workers must have a good understanding of domestic violence and abuse in the context of multiple disadvantage. They should have expertise around assertive outreach and innovative engagement with women experiencing domestic violence and abuse, who are likely too often to be in the presence of their perpetrator. And they're the recommendations, folks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to Sean and Julian and Ursula for sharing both of those personal stories and also going through the recommendations that have come out of the report. I'm hoping that Julian can hear this, thank you. But there were many oh, you can. Oh, fantastic. There were many thank yous coming through in the chat as well. So I was hoping the message would get through one way or the other. Great. Well, we have plenty of time now for questions and answers. And I'm going to start with a question for Julian and Ursula, but it also occurs to me that we've got a really broad range of people attending the session today. So I'm going to open up this question to anybody attending the session who has lived experience of homelessness as well. If it is a question that you would like to answer, please feel free to put your answer in the chat. The question is, what one thing do you wish that professionals had known or understood that would have made a difference to your situation when you were homeless, and how would it have helped? So if there is anybody who would like to share something in the chat as well, we have a range of professionals here today, so that is a good way to sort of get that one thing across as well, and I can pick up on those if there's any that come through in the chat. But for now, I'll ask that question to Julian and Ursula, whoever would like to go first. Is there one thing that you can think of that you just wish that people had known or understood?
Do you want to go first, Ursula, or shall I?
I think that's you, Julian.
Go on, Julian.
Yeah. First.
Okay, thank you. I think I was in a hostel after being sectioned. I came out pretty much homeless and then was put in a hostel. And after quite a while in that hostel, maybe over a year, I was then put into the move on accommodation. The move on accommodation, like I say, my share was really inappropriate. And I was really surprised. Basically, it took another year and a half to try and sort myself out after living in there for a while. And I was really surprised that there was no housing or tenancy officer that had gone to visit that property to determine whether or not it was appropriate or not, and just to look at the property, because it was just like bedsit type things, really grotty. And I just thought, well, if that's a kind of acceptable standard, you know, I've previously had my own house and I've lived and done all these different things, but I remember when I was like about 19 living in the bedsit, and it reminded me of that, you know, the sink was like a caravan sink and really grotty worktop, an old fridge that was cleaned out but yellow, you know, discoloured, and just the whole feel of the place was bad. And then the guy above me, who'd been moved in through the same service provider, ended up being a drug dealer. So I've been moved into this property with people knowing that I've come back from a substance misuse or substance use and alcoholic background, for which I'd done quite a lot of recovery around. I was actually clean when I'd gone into the property, consequently ended up relapsing, using, then being involved in the whole kind of scene of drugs, you know, people knocking on your window through the night and confrontation at the door. It was very difficult to then move myself out of that, to the point that I ended up being assaulted and left intentionally, you know, and then found it very difficult to be rehoused, ended up rough sleeping and going all through that process again. So I was back in the cycle. So I think one wish would have been a simple thing to check how appropriate their property is, that they're seeing as being a safe or acceptable place to be. So, and I'm kind of in a way of comparing now, because I'm in a good place, and I've got a nice, you know, it's a satellite flat, so it's still supported housing. I've got staff that see me once a day. It's very in place. I've just moved into it the last couple of weeks, but it's taken a year being in another property within that organisation where the office was, surrounded by staff, and it's kind of just, you know, having the comparison really. But I'm not naming names, but that different services providing very different outcomes, I guess. So I've gone on a bit.
No, that's fantastic, Julian. That's a really powerful example that you've given, and that's so clear how that could have just, that situation could have been totally different. And we've had somebody sharing in the chat as well, making a very similar point. So, you know, you're saying about, you know, checking how appropriate accommodation is for somebody. Is it actually, you know, as we've talked about with the report title, it's not just about having a roof, it's going to impact all different areas of your life. And someone else has very kindly and generously shared in the chat a similar kind of story about being honest about the type of accommodation you're being offered, and really thinking through what kinds of impacts that can have on someone's life. Absolutely. Ursula, I don't know whether you had anything that you wanted to add, that you wish that people had known and understood better.
Not really, but I think just like to go over the point that it really helps with a support worker that actually supports you, so to speak. Yeah. No, it's their passion, not just a job.
Thanks, Ursula. Yeah, that's something that you know, you kind of think should be you know, support worker that supports. You know, it seems obvious, but it makes such an incredible difference. And actually, Joe, that leads me to think about some research that CFE has done earlier in the Fulfilling Lives programme about the kinds of qualities that make that really feed into somebody being a positive navigator, I think is the words that kind of used, but those similar sorts of terms. And I don't know whether there's anything there that you would add from that research as well, that about how people can support.
Yeah, I think, as Ursula said, like you'd think it's common sense. You're a support worker, you're going to support. You know, the clues in the name, isn't it? But yeah, I think what Fulfilling Lives has managed to do is really kind of push forward those qualities that you could be looking for if you're recruiting, or you know, if you're and developing staff and supporting them as well. Like, you know, the support workers, navigators. It's a really tough job, and it's, you know, it's intense, and you're hearing stories all the time, and you know, bad things happen and stuff. So being able to have that support yourself as a worker as well makes you a better worker in you know, result, and having that space for you to reflect on your roles as well. So yeah, we do have a report around that. We can put, Chris, I don't know if Dean, and you can maybe pop the link in the chat at some point about, you know, what what Fulfilling Lives has said about, if you were going to have a navigator role in the service, what it should look like and what a job description might look like and that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thanks, Jo. Sean, I think I saw a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, what we'd heard was that for a lot of people, they felt that the housing workers, once they were housed, that was the problem done. You were off their books, you were no longer their problem, if you want, really. Whereas most people who are rough sleeping or spent time rough sleeping are facing other disadvantages as well. So as the report says, it's more than a roof. You need support. And it just, from the story that the Housing First guys were explaining how that works, that's the support people with facing multiple disadvantage need. It's not just the house. It's not just the four walls and the front door. You need extra support. And that, unfortunately, for many people, is not what we're hearing from, not what they're getting from housing departments in their areas. And that needs to change, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Right, we've got some questions coming through in the questions and answers box and plenty of comments coming through in the chat. So I'll do my best to kind of get around them. I'm going to come back to Jo, actually, from the first presentation, if we can remember back to there. Jo, there's a question here that says that you mentioned, well, and not just you, actually, this is something that's kind of come through from a lot of different discussions. We have been mentioning that single-sex accommodation options make a difference. Has there been an increase in these available? And if so, has there been any increase in visibility in areas of women struggling with homelessness? So actually, although that question mentions the first presentation, if there's anybody who'd like to say anything on this, then please do feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off because I read that question and I have been thinking about it. And actually, more often we were told that there's actually less of these options available in areas. I think, the one Ursula talked about is no longer. And, actually the overriding message from some of the areas was that, single-sex accommodation, these small places were actually fewer and far between now. I don't know, I actually was interested in maybe Philippa and Elpida with a Manchester perspective, whether you guys have seen any change in that sort of availability in Manchester at all.
As far as accommodation is concerned, I wouldn't say so. I experienced the fact that my girls didn't want to go to the accommodation that other girls were, only because they knew each other, they had arguments in the day centers. That was the number one issue. However, what came out of ICM is the Women Voices group, which is so powerful. It has given, so it's a group that was meeting every other Wednesday with absolutely any lady. It was a safe space in the hub that we used to be. The ladies could come over. It would be from a pampering session to watching movies or just having a chat, just women though. So they had this safe space and so much work has gone into that. My colleague Amanda Gates sees, the number one person, the expert on it, if you need any information. And also Philippa is part of that. So as far as accommodation is concerned, I wouldn't say that we have more options. What I would say is that more ladies were able to come out and we were able to see the hidden homelessness part of it. And we were, myself in Housing First and my ICM colleagues, we were able to go back to challenge accommodation given to the women, or as far as suitability is concerned. And on many occasions, I remember an occasion that she was pregnant, she presented over the phone domestic violence, and she chose not to go to the accommodation given. The duty was not taken off her. She moved to a flat that she actually wanted. So she was able to stay where she was. She felt better than going to accommodation that was for ladies, as it were. And eventually they gave her own flat. So that was big in our eyes.
Yeah, we've actually done a piece of work with the Women's Voices group recently around the importance of women-only spaces, not just accommodation, but having those networks and groups where it is only accessible to women, which we should be sharing in the next week or so I can make sure to send that over to everybody. But I think doing that piece of research just really highlighted how difficult they are to come by, and how being in a lot of support services make women feel like they can't speak freely, they're being judged, you know, in those sorts of male dominated spaces can be really difficult and make women feel like support isn't available to them in the same way.
And I'm sorry, the last bit that I would say is that we did recognize at Housing First that the last 3 years, the only referrals we were getting was only for women. We recognize that there were more services for men out there. So the only referrals we were taking was only for ladies.
Thanks a lot for those responses. And I think there's something there that you were saying, Alpida, that, you know, that just when we're saying that there should be options for women only, that doesn't mean that that is all that women should have access to. And so I think that returns back to the point that I can't remember who was making about choice and control. Actually, that was one of the principles of Housing First, but it's something that I think, and I've seen lots of nods around the screen anyway, that having options and having choice and control are part of being treated with dignity and respect. And so just because there is an option that could be suitable for somebody, it doesn't mean that that is what they necessarily must do, or that's the only option that should be available to them. You know, everybody's an individual, and while some women may feel safer in particular spaces, other women may prefer to be in other spaces. So it's very much kind of what's going to work for an individual. I've got another question here, which I'll throw out to everybody, I think, just to see what people's thoughts are. In the report, we talked about the importance of connections and in community, and we also talked about sort of peer mentors, all sorts of different ways that people can kind of connect with each other in thinking about, you know, the roof not just being the way out of homelessness. When we mentioned in the report, kind of went up to COVID-19, and obviously that's been a huge impact on everything, essentially. And so I was interested to see if people had any thoughts about moves to digital and online ways of connecting with each other. Obviously, that's what we're doing today. We're all here on Zoom, which is, you know, is working pretty well. We haven't had too many technical issues. But I'm interested in whether people felt that some of the ways in which services have moved to doing things online and through digital spaces has been helpful, or has been a good sort of, I suppose, temporary sort of solution during the pandemic and during a lot of the much stricter restrictions. Is it something that you feel should keep going, or is there more that we can do around digital inclusion to allow these kind of digital spaces to keep going and to support people and to stop people being isolated in different ways? So that's just a throwing that out there for anyone who's got anything that they'd like to say on that. Sean, you've got your hand raised.
I think in some areas it's been fantastic, you know, being able to reach out to people, particularly when they've been sort of isolated, you know, in their housing, and people have been worried about the COVID pandemic. We've seen some really good work from areas such as probation, making phone calls instead of insisting people come to meetings, people getting scripts, being sort of supported in not having to do the daily going to the chemist and getting their script, but being in control of sort of larger scripts and stuff like that. We've seen that. We've seen the All In program, which was brilliant throughout COVID. So I think we need to keep some of that, but we also have to remember that some people don't like it. Some people do want to come back physically, and we need to sort of be careful to make sure it's safe. But also, if people do want to engage, we have to make sure that they have the ability, the technology and the data to engage. And a lot of people can be left behind if they don't have those things. So I think some things have been great. Others have been probably even more isolating for people. We need to go back to some sort of hybrid model, I think. Don't, you know, throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's keep what's good, but let's try and get back to some sort of, you know, regular normality as well.
Thanks, Sean. Joe?
Yeah, sorry, Sean kind of said it already, but I was just going to say that I think if you want to take some positives from the pandemic, it's probably shown that that form of engagement does work better for some people, and that I think everyone we've spoken to about this just wants to see it be an option in the future. Like, you know, if you're talking about engaging with people, you want to offer as many potential routes to that or tools for that as you can, and digitally, you know, should be one of them, because we've shown that it can work for some people. However, you know, the danger is that it becomes the only way. It's cheaper, you know, that you don't have to travel. Maybe it's seen as a cheaper way to provide support to people, but you know, that the danger would be that it would overtake. But if it can stay as one option amongst many others, you know, I think that would be the best.
Hi, Ursula.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in Nottingham, at the start of the pandemic, the beneficiary ambassadors ran all around the experts on a weekly basis just to see how we were. And a few weeks later, they brought us all a handset and topped it up for us. And yeah, it's been a lifeline, really. Yeah, really grateful for it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ursula. And yeah, I think that goes back to the point that we were kind of talking about a bit before as well, about personal budgets and some of that flexibility that workers can be allowed to have some funds to just be able to respond to what's going to be useful then. I mean, Alpiza, you talked about that really really helpfully in terms of thinking about what makes a house a home, a TV, and well, obviously with a TV, you need a TV license, but just being able to have, I suppose, the discretion to be able to provide, as you say, whether it's a phone or data or things that are needed in a particular situation to help somebody connect to others is so powerful. I can't believe where we're getting to with the time. We're kind of running through here. We do have another question which we can kind of go around and ask. I think there's more that are kind of coming through as well in the chat. I'm really sorry that we've not necessarily been able to get to everything. But if there are things at the end, please do rest assured that we'll capture those and communicate in writing afterwards to follow up with any points that we haven't managed to get to. So a last question for everybody is, I suppose, just trying to think about ending on a slight positive note. We've talked about some of the kind of the issues that have been thrown up through this research and through the discussions. So I'd like to think about something positive. Is there anything that you can see that is changing for the better? And if so, what is it? And why do you think that will make a difference? So again, I'll just throw that open to everybody, and we've got Joe.
I think, you know, the fact that we're sat here, Julian's on the call, Ursula's on the call, you know, all the work that the NECG have been doing, and not just them, you know, the local groups, and, you know, I think, you know, there's definitely not the problem solved or anything like that, but you guys are getting the opportunity to tell your story, to be heard, to attend national forums. You know, I think that really is a positive. It's a step. There's still many more steps to take. I'm sure you'll agree, Sean, you know, to get listened and to get, you know, things like the recommendations that you guys put together actually, you know, moving towards them being enacted. But, you know, you're here, you're able to engage in forums, I think, in a way that potentially you weren't able to do sort of 8-10 years ago, maybe. But maybe you want to say more about that, Sean, but that's sort of an overriding feeling that I get when we do work like this.
Yeah, sure. Do you have something?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, as we said about the changes, COVID has brought many changes, and it's been disastrous for lots of people and national. But in some ways, there's been a real silver lining, and being able to keep sort of in touch with the areas and feedback their response. And, you know, government talking about the voice of lived experience and how important the voice of lived experience is. I'd never heard that sort of 2 years ago. And now I hear lots of ministers talking about lived experience. We've got the new Changing Futures program that's taking over from Fulfilling Lives that hopefully will take the baton on and use the voice of lived experience to change services for the better for people facing multiple disadvantage. And I think the realization that, you know, you've got to spend some money to actually save some money. We've seen that with Dame Carol Black's drug review and the government taking on that on board. You know, Changing Futures being supported by the Department for Levelling Up. The whole levelling up agenda, if it comes to something, and strange to see that Mr. Gove, who's leading DLUC, spoke about how the trickle-down effect hadn't worked. So I'm amazed to see, you know, 40 years of economic policy just admitted this ain't worked. Let's try something else. So it's, you know, those are the things that give me hope, really, and the organisations that have been created and the work Fulfilling Lives has done is just amazing, really. So hopefully we can carry that baton on. So there's definitely a silver lining there, and there's a sunshine coming through the clouds.
Thanks, Sean. Philippa, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what everyone said about, Sean used the phrase earlier, nothing about me without me. And I think that's something that's really run through a lot of Fulfilling Lives programs, and really, you know, it's a short phrase, it really encapsulates that sort of concept. But I was going to add, I think partnership working's been something that's been really successful, especially ICM, but I think with all the Fulfilling Lives programs, and that's, you know, sort of continuing and being built on through the Changing Futures program. I think no one person or organisation knows everything about every service. So by talking to each other properly, not only do you learn from each other and learn different ways of working and have the flexibility to kind of change and evolve, but also it stops that, you know, classic having to retell a story to a million different services, you know, just by as simple as talking to each other. I think that's really important and something that's working well.
Brilliant, thanks, Philippa. Ursula, Julian, or Elpida, if any of you have anything that you think you'd like to contribute in terms of thinking maybe what's changing or what you think is working a bit better, then please feel free. Oh yes, Elpida.
Again, I agree with what everybody has said and what Philippa said. The difference that I've seen, I've been doing this work since 2010. The difference that I've seen 10 years on, how probation is working with us, the flexibility that they, CPN, they're working with us, they trust us to see people when the people cannot go to them, or to facilitate phone calls, things like that. We saved so much money, you know, by not having to get people back into custody because they missed one of their appointments only because we saw them. This is just amazing. What Sean said, you have to spend money to save money, absolutely 100%. The fact that I was able and lucky enough to have a flexible fund for my clients to get them a big TV, a 32, 40 inches TV, a punch bag, because this is what they wanted, a really lush carpet, made a massive difference to the people going in. How many times they felt valued, and I think in shock that they were able to use their money like that. So partnership working, a massive change, absolutely massive change, and also having money to spend on people. Again, what a difference does it make?
Fantastic, thank you. Julian or Ursula, if there is anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add that I'm getting, and it seems like there's a much more awareness of SMD, severe multiple disadvantage, and that term being not only made aware, but also it's becoming recognised, and kind of being part of that's been very promising. So, because I'm a service user, but I'm also getting more involvement with system change and being part of the lived experience element to things. So I think that's been something that's been, you know, prior to me, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Ursula?
Within the changing futures in Nottingham, they've just appointed specialist workers and moving forward with the dual diagnosis so that people can sort of have help with addiction and mental health instead of it being separate. That's something quite new at the moment. I think we had it years ago and then the funding went and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Excellent point. Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope that's sort of leaving us feeling a little bit more positive about all these different things that I think we've highlighted that, you know, we've kind of given quite clear recommendations that have come out of this research, but yeah, lots of things that we see that are changing and improving in different ways as well. And personally, I'm just really pleased that there have been so many people attending this session as well. There didn't seem to be anyone sort of arguing with the recommendations or the things that we've been talking about in here. So I think that's a really, really positive. And actually, thank you so much to everybody who's attended for sending through such interesting points and questions and for sharing from other experiences as well. So we're just about to wrap up actually. So I have mentioned before, but if there are any last questions or comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to put those into the chat or the questions and answers, and we will get back to those via email. So thank you so much for engaging with the work here, and a special thanks obviously goes to all of the participants, but also Sean, Philippa, Elpida, Julian, Ursula, and Joe for sharing with us your thoughts. If you would like to follow us further, if you are not that aware of Fulfilling Lives, we've got the National Evaluation website where we have referred to some of the research that's on there, but there is a whole lot more that we haven't referred to that can be used in so many different ways. So we've got the website on the screen now. You can also sign up for our quarterly newsletter as well. We have got a range of different events coming up over the next several months. There's lots and lots of opportunities to engage with more of the learning coming out of the Fulfilling Lives programme. So please do sign up for the website. And if there's any particular things that people would like to discuss further with me, my email address is there in the bottom right of the screen as well. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter. So thank you so much again to everybody who's joined. I really appreciate it. And all that's left to say is I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.